npx create React app, useReducer. I'm going to do it in the context of a user login. What is useReducer? useReducer is a React hook. It's an alternative to useState, and it helps you to manage complex state logic in React applications. useReducer is definitely not a walk in the park, but it flows naturally following useContext and before Redux, the external state management library. Because when combined with useContext, it can be a great alternative to Redux. So when do you use useReducer? As the React documentation says, useReducer is usually preferable to useState when you have complex state logic that involves multiple sub-values or when the next state depends on the previous one. I would add that the state logic probably has to be incredibly complex before you start considering useReducer. It's probably a situation where you're setting states left, right, and center, or a change in state triggers a whole series of events that just feels like it's getting out of hand. Because useReducer comes with a lot of boilerplate code, so it must be worth the effort. That being said, let's clear up the file, install Tailwind CSS, and jump into it. I'm going to do it in the context of a user login. Just a simple, straightforward front-end user login for demonstration purposes. It's very hackable, highly not recommended for use in real life, but I think it makes more sense than using a counter as an example, which you see being used a lot. And I understand why. It's easier to demonstrate and easier to understand, but I don't know if it's just me. I always found it quite difficult to extrapolate from the counter scenario and try to apply it to other cases. So I'm just going to use this login system instead. I'm just going to quickly set it up first. We'll have a form and 2 input fields with a login button. The login button will submit the form and will do some very basic user authentication. I'm having to add the autocomplete in the input tag because React was complaining about it in the console log, so I'm just adding that in. This is all pretty straightforward and shouldn't need any explaining, so I'm just going to stop talking and let you enjoy some ASMR moment. Alright, that's all set up. Let's check out useReducer. So the useReducer hook is used to store and update states, right? But how does it actually work? The first step is to initialize it. Similar to useState, useReducer returns an array of two values, which can be destructured as the current value of state and a dispatch function, whereby it will dispatch an action. All that means is we have const and then state, dispatch in square brackets here. Then useReducer, which accepts two arguments, the reducer function and the initial state. For our little login system, let's give it the name login reducer. You can use any name you want here. If you only have one reducer, you could just call it reducer. If you end up having multiple reducers, you may want to differentiate it. I'm just choosing to call it login reducer here because I can. Then our initial state. We have username, password, logged in, and error. So our initial state will be an object like this. The initial state of each username, password, logged in, and error is consistent with their initial states when we were using useState. Then we have the reducer function. We called it login reducer, so the function will be const login reducer, and it will accept two parameters, the current state and an action object that is dispatched. This is how the hook updates the value of its states. The action determines how the value of state will change. Then it will return the new state. Due to the nature of useReducer, a switch statement often makes the most sense because the alternative would be a series of if-else statements. And compared with a very long if-else ladder, a switch statement is significantly faster because it's implemented using a jump table, which generates at compile time. As a result, during execution, instead of checking which case is satisfied, it only decides which case has to be executed. On the other hand, in a long list of if-else statements, every condition is evaluated at runtime, so the last item takes much more time to reach. And since useReducer is used for complex state management, when one state depends on another or multiple sub-values are involved, a switch statement is usually the more optimal preferred choice. I'm assuming everyone is familiar with switch statements, which is a pure JavaScript concept. This React to useReducer concept might be quite confusing right now, but it should be much clearer by the time we finish. Okay, so switch statement. As our switch variable, we have action.type. What is action.type? An action object will have a property of type. It's a string that essentially acts as a label for the state update that is going to be carried out by the reducer. As such, you'll want to use a sensible name that identifies what's changing. As an example, in a counter situation, you typically use increase and decrease for the type. Here, our first action type will be field because we have two input fields, right? A username field and a password field. This is our first case variable, field. If there is a match for field, so when the field action is dispatched, this is where we set the values of the username field and the password field. And we do it by returning first a copy of our current state, then we set the field name as the payload. Payload is just computing lingo for some useful information that is being carried. In this case, carried by an action object. In simple terms, this is just setting the username as the e.target.value. I understand that this is probably getting more confusing. useReducer is hard, and this is probably the hardest part of useReducer, so bear with me and it'll become much clearer once we're done. So let's move on to our next action type, login. When the login action is dispatched, we're going to return our current state and set error message as an empty string. Then, when success action is dispatched, we return the current state, set logged in to true, and password to empty string. I think here is where we're beginning to see how the useState is being translated into this reducer function. So let's carry on. The error action is even clearer, I think. We're returning the current state and setting the error message to incorrect username or password as a string. Logged in is false, username is empty string, and password is empty string. In the case of logout, we return current state and set logged in as false. Then for our default, we just return the state. Phew! Okay, that's the prep work done. Now we need to actually utilize the dispatch functions. So let's go down and run through what we need to do in our app function. First, in our handle submit, underneath e.preventDefault, instead of set error as empty string, we'll just have dispatch, and within the parenthesis is the action that we're dispatching. We will have an action object, and it has to have at least the property of type. In this case, the type is login. If we go back up, what does the login type do? It returns our current state and sets the error to an empty string, which is what we just replaced. Next, username. The username has to be updated to state.username because previously we simply named the state as username as part of the useState hook initialization. But now, with the useReducer hook, if we recall, the state is an object containing the username. So in order to get to the username, we need to access the state object first. And that's why it's state.username. And it's the same with password. It's state.password. Then instead of set logged in, we do dispatch type success. So if username is Jerry and password is Tom, we're dispatching the action type of success, which then sets logged in as true in our switch statement. Next, if there's an error, let me comment out what we currently have first so we can compare it later. Here we have dispatch type error. Within our switch statement, our error action is doing exactly the same thing as what we've just commented out, which is to set the error message as that string and then set username and password as empty strings. Let's keep going. Logged in here is state.loggedin, then state.username. Here, set logged in false will become dispatch type logout. Then state.username down here in our input field. And on change, we dispatch an action. We want to get the user input for the username, right? In our switch statement, we first have to match the action type. So within this action object, we have to have the type as field first. Then in the switch statement, we were setting the field name as payload. So here, the next property we'll have is field name, which we'll call username as a string. And the third and last property we will have is payload, which is e.target.value. And that's all. We have the action type. If the action type is field, we return the current state, and where the field name is username, we set that as the value that the user enters, e.target.value. After username input, we have the password input, which is exactly the same. The value is state.password, and on change, in our action object, type is still field. The field name property is password as a string, and the payload property, i.e. information being carried in this action object, is what the user enters for password. So that's e.target.value. And finally, this error message here will be state.error. Let's go over the password input once more, but we'll do it in reverse. So in our password input, on change, we dispatch an action object. This action object has three properties: the type, which is field as a string, the field name, which is password as a string, and the payload, which is e.target.value. When the user starts typing in the password field, the switch statement recognizes that it's of type field, so it returns the current state, which, if the user is coming to this page for the first time and haven't entered the username, it will just be our initial state. But if on first coming onto the page, the user has already entered the username, then our current state will have captured whatever the user put in for the username, and the rest of the properties remain in their initial state. So the username will have a value, the password is still empty, logged in is still false, and error is still empty. As the user starts typing the password, because action.fieldName is action.payload, and we've said that the field name for the password field is password, and the payload is what the user types for that input field. So as the user types, it's setting the value of that input field to the password property. And hence, password is whatever the user enters. I hope that makes it clearer. What I'm planning to do next is to do a slightly bigger project and use the Redux library to wrap it up. And I think that will probably be the last of this React mini project series. So I think we'll do Redux, which is quite a popular pairing with React, and then we'll just leave it there. See you next time.